Hello again. This is the 5th lecture in a series on effective writing. Today we'll focus on editing. But before we do, I'd like to review, as always, the 6 major concerns for all effective writing. Those are audience and purpose, blueprinting, construction, dissent, editing, and field testing. The ABCs of effective writing. Audience and purpose is always central to the writing process. You must know whom you're addressing and why. If you don't know whom you're addressing, your message may simply misfire. If you don't know why you're addressing that person, that group, that country, your message may misfire. The audience and purpose that you choose should be susceptible to revision as you learn more by going through the process of writing. Make an explicit statement of audience and purpose, and be prepared to revise that statement as you go through blueprinting, construction, dissent, and even editing, and especially field testing. Blueprinting is a graphic, dynamic process in which you identify the materials that you want for your document and their arrangement. It is a dialectic between the ideal and the practical. You may find that you want to have all sorts of information to buttress your point, but realize that your particular audience will read no more than 1 page of detail. Does that mean some detail should be shifted to an appendix? Does it mean instead you should take only 1 representative detail and make it more vivid? You need to decide that on the basis of your knowledge of your audience and purpose and of what the blueprint is trying to be a design for overall. Blueprints should give us a way to open the door into the room which is your document, to be in that room, and to close the door. Opening the door requires us to label the door. Here follows a memo on the following subject. Or to reveal essential reality. Prices are up when weather is good. Or to suggest 7/8 of the contents of the room. I'd like to take you through the last 4 quarters as we see what happens when new salesmen are hired. Then the conclusion, the closing of the door, may say something not about sales, but about the hiring process, for instance. Leave that extra something to give that parting shot the most possible impact. Audience and purpose, blueprinting. Both are explicit, both are dynamic. One may cause you to change the other. Once you have a plausible blueprint, begin constructing your document. Look in the blueprint and then write out the words necessary. If the blueprint calls for an interesting example from the Northeast region, stop your writing and go and find an interesting example from the Northeast region. If you can't find such an example, figure out why you wanted such an example and figure out what other kind of example might come close. A dialectic between the ideal and the real, the desirable and the possible, changing the audience and purpose statement, the blueprint, and even the constructed document as you go. When you are in the room, the blueprint should direct you either to survey the contents of the room according to some clear, logical principle, or to organize your survey of the room in the structure of the meeting of a straw man. These are the reasons people would dissent. Then you can meet those reasons. Or, in a more sophisticated way, take those 2 parts of the material in the room and ping-pong back and forth between them. If you do that, it's especially important that you have key terms. Terms that will help fix your reader's understanding of what you mean to be doing by that writing. Terms that will make the use of that particular logical principle for structuring the materials seem quite appropriate. The principle can be chronology, value, emotional impact, what have you, but it should relate directly and sensibly to your subject and to your view on that subject. Having been in the room and presented all this material, you then want to close the door. Leave your reader with that parting image which will come to stand for all that you have discussed, or a call for action. The more specific, the better. So, we now have audience and purpose, blueprint, and a constructed document. What do we do with this document? We revise it. We look at it again, a second vision, with the eyes of the potentially dissenting reader. The absolutely dissenting reader is of no use to us, because that person will never be convinced. The person who is absolutely convinced is of little use to us, because the document can't have the effect of conversion. It can't make the person believe us, since the person already does. The audience we need to aim for is the audience of potentially dissenting readers, those who think about the possibility, entertain it, but test it, and if the test is found successful, accept it. If we're writing for the potentially dissenting reader, we will begin to see problems that we had not seen when we were writing out of our own more thoughtless language, out of the language we use when we understand our own assumptions. The potentially dissenting reader might see a word that we mean one way, progress for example, and take it a different way. Revising with the eyes of the potentially dissenting reader, we should catch those things and fix them. There are certain general grounds for dissent. The ethical argument might fail. There might be prior genuine disagreement. There might be misunderstanding based on word choice or structure. And there might be subsequent disagreement. Well, I hear what you say, but I don't accept it. In each case, the effective writer tries to understand how that dissent arose and revise the document accordingly. This doesn't mean simply changing a word here or there in the text, tinkering with the construction. It often means a new blueprint, a new statement of audience and purpose. The dialectic, in other words, grows. We consider audience and purpose, blueprint, construction, and dissent all mobile in relation to each other. Once we have a document that we can use, once we have something that we feel is fairly refined, then we edit it. We make sure that the words, the spelling, the grammar, the nuances, everything is just right. That's what we'll focus on in this lecture. But after we're done deciding that everything is just right, we still want to take our document and give it to colleagues or give it to strangers and see how it works. Field test the document. The more important the document, the more serious the field test to see if we have created something that has the effect that we want. Let's take a look now, focusing on editing. The key concepts here are these. Grammar, spelling, and mechanics really count. They're not just a matter of some old school teacher's pernickettiness. They really count both ethically and semantically. What do I mean by that? Ethically, we have shown ourselves to be expert as users of language if we get all of these details right. So we want to show ourselves to be expert because, as Aristotle said, the ethical argument is the most important argument. Also, they count semantically. What we understand from a word depends exactly on its grammatical use, even on its spelling, even, as we saw in the first lecture, on whether or not a word is capitalized. So the mechanics count, ethically and semantically. A second key concept about editing is this. There are too many rules to remember. Therefore, rely on tacit knowledge. Accept the fact that you do know more than you can say, that you may know some things you have never even thought to say, but they're in there. But if in doubt, rely not only on your tacit knowledge, but on your handbook, including its glossary, and on your dictionary. So, these things count. Let me see if I can show you some of the more common ways in which they do count. But please understand that most of what we're about to discuss hereafter really could be gotten by careful attention to a good handbook and a good dictionary. Nonetheless, people often forget to use them. Let's start with grammar. Consider this sentence. I love you in the spring. Now the question I have for you is this. If I wanted to say the word only in that sentence, where should I put it? I've often asked classes this question, and I ask people to write down where they should put the word. As you see on your screen, the word only is written above the words, I love you in the spring. Draw a line in your mind from the word only down to the left or right of one of those words. Where does it belong? The reason I ask the question this way is that most people with a word like only just throw it in whenever it happens to cross their minds. The same thing is true with a word like simply, or really, or just. These are words that modify other words, and somehow we find them a bit mobile. Is it good that they be mobile? I think not. Take a look at what happens when you put the only to the left of I. Only I love you in the spring means that no one else loves you in the spring. I only love you in the spring may mean that I like you year-round, except for the spring when I only love you. I love only you in the spring, whereas in the winter, I love many people. I love you only in the spring again means I love you at only the one time of year, at others I do not. I love you in only the spring. That kind of grammatical reconstruction has a kind of poetic feel to it. It again says, I love you at only one time of year, but it suggests that perhaps there's something magical about that. I love you in the only spring. That suggests that because of my love for you, somehow all of eternity has become spring. And I love you in the spring only may mean that I love you at no other season. There are, depending upon how one cares to count and what semantic distinctions one wants to make, perhaps 4 distinctly different meanings that can come out of that multitude of possible placements of the word only in the sentence, I love you in the spring. In normal discourse, we put in the only whenever we think of it as we speak. In writing, we should use the control available to us. We should find the best place to put in each word, as well, of course, as putting in the best words. Let me give you another example of how grammar is really important semantically. Which of these is correct? I like you better than him, or I like you better than he. I like you better than him. I like you better than he. I've asked many classes this, and I normally have a divided reaction. Some people say, I like you better than him is correct. Others say, I like you better than he is correct. But a few people come up with a right answer. They're both correct. I like you better than him means I like you better than I like him. I like you better than he means I like you better than he likes you. Why should I bother to point to this difference? Because people often ask, why bother with the difference between him and he? You knew what I meant, didn't you? The answer is, not if I was really paying attention, because in fact, those can mean 2 different things. And I may think you mean one, but I may be mistaken. If my language competence extends to understanding the distinction between I like you better than him and I like you better than he, I may correct you because I misunderstand what you mean. You really knew what I meant, didn't you? Maybe I did, but maybe I was mistaken in thinking I did. Many people think that the niceties of English grammar are something just to be studied by persnickety, as I say, old school teachers, What's the difference between who and whom? Why should I have to say, whom do you like, instead of who do you like? The difference between whom and who is exactly, precisely the difference between him and he. If you could take a sentence that had in it a who or a whom and turn it around so that for that word beginning with W, you needed to substitute either a he or a him. If the word you need to substitute is him, what you should have used was whom. If the word you needed to substitute was he, the word you should have used was who. The distinction between who and whom, technically known as a distinction in case, that is, case is a grammatical category, is a distinction which clearly continues to live in a sentence like, I like you better than him versus I like you better than he. People say, well, you understand what I mean when I use who and I should use whom, or vice versa. And I say, no, I don't understand, because what you're doing by not caring about that M, that distinction between who and whom, is wiping out a crucial distinction which sometime you may need in the difference between I like you better than him and I like you better than he. In other words, we need to learn the grammar. Now, this is a problem because we speak a language we learn growing up. Our language competence is not competence in all varieties of the language. I cannot, for example, with great reliability, speak the English of Chaucer from the hundreds of years ago, and many white people cannot speak with great reliability the dialect shared by many black Americans. There are many people, my immigrant grandparents, for example, who spoke a variety of English that had different grammatical structures from either the standard English that I speak or certain other dialects of English. How's by you, they would ask. By me, it's fine. That was a variety of English, and it worked perfectly well, but their competence in English was really a competence in their dialect of English. How do you decide what dialect you want to use? Very difficult question. If you're writing for academic or business purposes, unless you have an overwhelming reason to pick some other dialect of English, write in what is called Standard English. This is the dialect that most people will recognize as demonstrating that you are familiar with and successful in the institutions that underlie the economic dominant of our culture. Schools, business, the military, and so on. If you choose to speak in another dialect or write in another dialect, by all means do. But do it thoughtfully, understanding that here I am addressing an audience which is more familiar with that dialect, or here I'm addressing an audience that would prefer to be addressed by someone who speaks that dialect or writes that dialect, an audience that will say, because this is in my dialect, that person is like me. In other words, to decide what dialect to use, you need to understand your audience and purpose, as always in writing. For the sake of this discussion, I'll assume, since most writing that most people are worried about polishing has to do with the academic or the business spheres, that most people will strive most of the time to write what is called Standard English and stay within the realm of that dialect. Please do understand, I'm not suggesting you must, only that it is practical. It is a way to be, in most cases, but not all, more effective. And that's what we're about, effective writing. Now, if my grandfather were to have said, how's by you? And I said, Grandpa, that's not right. He'd say, well, how could I know? My competence is in this dialect. And I'd say, you can't know, but here's a handbook. If you know that some people write who where you would write whom and vice versa, but you can't rely on your tacit knowledge, open your handbook, look in the index, find the difference between who and whom as it's supposed to be in so-called Standard English. Why do this? You do it to have an effect with your audience. If you believe that that's important, then you should rely on it. Although we have much tacit knowledge, we have tacit knowledge only of what we have learned. We have not all learned Standard English. Let's look at something else we haven't all learned very well. English spelling is a disaster. English is not what is known as a phonographic language. Phono means sound, graph means write. Among linguists, a phonographic language is a language which is written as it is sounded. Polish, for instance, is a phonographic language. I am told, I don't speak Polish, that although they use letters somewhat differently from the way we in English use some of the same letters, those letters with whatever values they carry, in fact, carry them absolutely exactly the same in every context, and if you can read Polish at all, you can read every word in Polish and pronounce it perfectly. In fact, I'm told that in Polish there is no word to spell, because spelling is not an issue. Writing is the same as spelling, because if you understand the sound, you can write it exactly. In English, of course, this is impossible. George Bernard Shaw said that in English we could spell fish G-H-O-T-I. That's the G-H from tough, the O from women, and the T-I from nation. G-H-O-T-I. Fish. Spelling English is difficult. It's no wonder we all make mistakes. Nowadays, much writing is done with word processors. People write a document, and then they hit the spell checker. The spell checker whips through the document, and it stops at words like G-H-O-T-I, and it suggests other options like G-O-T. And of course, since you meant to spell fish, you won't find the right option there, and you will then just write in F-I-S-H instead. That's not a problem. The problem is, if you write W-A-S, was, but you meant to write S-A-W, saw, the spell checker won't stop and ask you what you meant, because both of those are perfectly fine English words. Now you may say, not a problem. I will proofread. I will proofread slowly. I will proofread out loud so that I'm forced to say and focus on each word individually. I will catch errors like was and saw. And so you will. But you won't catch errors if you don't understand the difference between two properly spelled English words. For example, here are 4 sets of words that have different meanings. For instance, look at the first set. Discrete and discrete. Which of those is correct? It turns out that discrete, spelled E-T-E, means separate. I kept my business and my personal life discrete from each other. Whereas discreet, E-E-T, means tactful, quiet, not speaking too much out loud. Now, it may well be that in order to keep my personal and business life discrete from each other, I have to be discreet. But if I'm writing, I really do need to decide what I'm trying to communicate. Am I trying to communicate discrete, or am I trying to communicate discrete? The spell checker won't help me. It will take both of them and tell me they are correct English words. The only way to learn better is to be alert to words that you recognize in a context that you're not sure of. Look them up in the dictionary. Check them in the usage glossary of your handbook. Take a look at the second set. L-E-A-D versus L-E-D. L-E-A-D can be pronounced lead, as in a lead pencil. L-E-D can be pronounced lead, as in I led the bull to the fair. L-E-A-D, lead, does not mean L-E-D, lead. Interestingly, and this is I think one of the great causes for the confusion, L-E-A-D can also be pronounced lead. I lead the bull to the fair, L-E-A-D. What did I do yesterday? I led the bull to the fair, L-E-D. If I write I-L-E-A-D, the bull to the fair, yesterday, I've made a mistake. But the spell checker will never catch it. We need to catch it. There are many words that cause problems like this again and again. For instance, the past tense of lie is lay. I lie down on the bed today. I lay down on the bed yesterday. The past tense of lay is laid. I lay the book on the table today. I laid the book on the table yesterday. Since the past tense of one word is identical with the present tense of another word, Since lay, the past tense of lie, is identical with lay, the present tense of a word whose past tense is laid, people confuse lay, lie, and laid a lot. How do you get them straight if you don't have tacit knowledge of that, if it's not in your dialect? You notice it once, you write it down, you put it on an index card, and you slip that index card inside the end papers of your handbook. And when you go to write whatever are the problems that you know you have sometimes encountered, you take a quick glance to make sure you remember what they are and proceed. When in doubt, check the usage glossary, check the dictionary. Take a look at the third spelling set. Born versus born. B-O-R-N means I was born yesterday. B-O-R-N-E means I bore my troubles yesterday well. That is, my troubles were born easily yesterday. B-O-R-N-E is a past participle of the verb to bear. B-O-R-N is the present participle of the verb meaning to get born. They sound the same, their meaning is quite different, because to bear as in carry is quite different from to bear as in give birth. How to distinguish them? Look in a dictionary. Do we know how to do it? Many of us don't. Many of us have to look them up again and again. Take a look at the fourth pair. L-O-O-S-E versus L-O-S-E. The first is loose. The second is lose. In fact, they have the same vowel sound. Oo. Lose, loose. The difference between two O's and one O, turns out to be a difference in how you pronounce the S, not in how you pronounce the O's. It's no wonder people might confuse them. But you need to remember that loose is an adjective, the cattle were running loose, and lose is a verb. I lose my place from time to time and have to look back at my notes. In addition to spelling, which clearly has semantic implications and cannot be trusted to a spell checker, but only to your intelligent interaction with your writing, mechanics also is crucial. Some questions of mechanics people feel they understand or they see as important because they've been told they're important. They know that they're supposed to put an apostrophe before an S to indicate possession, for example. But they find that they're not sure exactly where to put that apostrophe in a word like its. This was, see my dog, this is its collar. Does he take an apostrophe or not? Most people think, or many people think, apostrophe for possession, I-T apostrophe S. Guess what? It's wrong. It's, like his, hers, theirs, and ours, are possessive pronouns without an apostrophe. It's with an apostrophe is an abbreviation for leaving out the it has or it was, just like can't or don't, you have the apostrophe for an abbreviation. How can you remember which way it goes? You've got to look it up. The spell checker won't help you. You need to get the mechanics right. Most people know that if they've hit it as a problem. Fine. Write it on your index card, slip it in the end papers. But what about things you haven't noticed? That's what I'd like you to look at in the next 4 examples. Take a look at the first one. Fast food consumer. What's wrong with that? Remember we discussed under dissent that we could find that we have misunderstanding based on structure. There really are 2 completely different ways to read those 3 words. We can talk about a fast food consumer, someone who consumes fast food, that is, mass-produced hamburgers and so on. Or we could talk about a fast food consumer, someone who consumes food very rapidly. How do you distinguish between a fast food consumer and a fast food consumer? The answer is the hyphen. Many people think, you put a hyphen in wherever the dictionary tells you to. So if you wonder, is a word hyphenated or squashed together or 2 separate words, just look in the dictionary. Indeed, that's a good place to start. But in fact, usually you need a hyphen not because the dictionary calls for it, but because you need to disambiguate an ambiguous structure. A fast food consumer, a consumer of fast food, is indicated by putting that hyphen between the fast and the food. A fast food consumer is indicated by putting a hyphen between the food and the consumer, a fast food consumer. The dictionary won't tell you to put in the hyphen. You have to recognize that there's a possible ambiguity. You have to recognize that although you have already tried to read with the eyes of a dissenting reader, now you're getting down to the editing, the mechanics, the grammar, the spelling, the details, and at this point, you still may be making differences in meaning by how you adjust things. Fast food consumer, fast food consumer. Take a look at the second. What do you do with commas? Where do you put those little devils? Well, there are many rules for them, many rules for them, and again, I rely on your handbook, but let me just try to convince you how important it is to think about those rules. The first example, after they kissed, Mary Sue smiled happily, is really quite different from after they kissed Mary, Sue smiled happily. Move that comma over, and you've added one more person and changed the scene entirely. After they kissed, say Mary Sue and Bob, Mary Sue smiled happily. After they kissed Mary, say Bob and Bill kissed Mary, Sue, her sister, smiled happily. Where do you put the comma? Depends on what you mean. Fixing matters of grammar, mechanics, spelling, these are not things to be done just by the rules. The rules exist to help us express meanings. When we look in the dictionary and we look in the handbook, we are not looking for the rule. We're looking for the set of rules that cover all the possible meanings we can generate, and then we have to pick among them, having a clear, explicit understanding of exactly what we're trying to say. Take a look, for example, at the third. This is from Time magazine. I will let you read it to yourself in your course book before I read it aloud, because I don't want my voice to indicate to you how it must be read. What it says is, the most haunting track is Let Me In, which harks back to Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of the grunge trio Nirvana who committed suicide in April. What that says is, the trio committed suicide in April. What I think was intended, since I know this is historically the fact, is that Kurt Cobain committed suicide in April, and he had been part of a trio called Nirvana. It should have said the most haunting track is Let Me In, comma, which harks back to Kurt Cobain, comma, the lead singer of the grunge trio Nirvana, comma, which is missing there but should have been there, who committed suicide in April. Setting off that phrase, the lead singer of the grunge trio Nirvana, between commas, changes the meaning entirely. That setting off of the meaning is called apposition. When a phrase, a word, a clause, what have you, is in apposition, it provides information that the speaker or writer wants the reader to have, but which the speaker or writer acknowledges is not crucial to understand the meaning of the utterance. The difference between something which is crucial to the utterance and not crucial to the utterance is the difference between what is called restrictive and non-restrictive usage. Let me give an example of that in the next. My wife Elizabeth went to the store. You could put commas around Elizabeth, or you could not put commas around Elizabeth. What's the difference? If you put commas around Elizabeth, then you are saying that the word Elizabeth is in apposition. It's non-restrictive. The main point of the sentence is, my wife went to the store, and by the way, her name is Elizabeth. If you leave out those commas, then you're saying that that is a restrictive use of the word Elizabeth. The point is dependent upon knowing that my wife Elizabeth went to the store. Now, as it happens, I have only one wife. If I had many wives, then of course we would need to distinguish between my wife Elizabeth who went to the store and my wife Irma who went to the bakery. If I don't have a wife Irma, I should have commas around the Elizabeth of my wife. Leaving out those commas suggests a restrictive use. With the commas, non-restrictive. What difference does this make? Everybody knows I have only one wife. People in this country have only one wife. Isn't that so? Not so for bigamists. Not so for some Mormons. Not so in other places or other times. And let's say we're not talking about my wife, but we're talking about my dog. You have no way of knowing how many dogs I have. I could have one or I could have many. Is it important to know my dog's name or not to know my dog's name? Is this a restrictive use or a non-restrictive use? The handbook can't tell you. You have to decide that according to your meaning. But once you've decided it, then the handbook can tell you how to punctuate it. Is this an important idea? Yeah. One of the most common questions people ask me about grammar is, how do you know when to use which and when to use that? This is the boy that I like. This is the boy which I like. The answer is incredibly simple to state and woefully difficult to use. The answer is, when you want to use a restrictive phrase, you use that. When you want a non-restrictive phrase, you use which. This is the book that I read over vacation. Means I want you to know exactly when I read it. This is the book which I read over vacation. Means this is the book that we may have been talking about before, and by the way, I read it over vacation. That is restrictive, which is non-restrictive. And I made a mistake earlier in saying the boy that I like. Some grammarians, but not all, would say that in no case should you use either that or which when you refer to human beings. It should always be who. That is the boy whom I like. I like him, whom I like. That is the boy who went to the store with me. That is the boy, he went to the store with me. He, who, him, whom. Who or whom for human beings, that for restrictive, which for non-restrictive. Does it make a difference? Yes, because it indicates what the speaker thinks about what the speaker is saying or writing. And it's only by those indications that the audience can understand what it is that the speaker is saying or writing. There is a host of such problems that people encounter all the time. What I recommend you do is sit down with that handbook and look for a few interesting things. Do you say John Smith, comma, M period D period, or John Smith, M period D period, for John Smith the doctor? It turns out it's comma, M period D period, because it's supposed to be non-restrictive. It's not that the person is supposed to get his identity from being a physician, but there are physicians who write it, John Smith, MD, as if that is my identity. The difference is one of tone. It conveys a feeling of who the person is. Having conveyed a feeling of who the person is, one has established one's ethos. And the ethical argument, remember, is the single most important one, according to Aristotle. Aristotle, I think, was often right. Let me give you an idea of how much you might really know about these things without really having known you know it. For our first exercise today, I'd like you to take a look at what is in your course booklet under exercise, or what's on the screen now. John, where, Jack, had, 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 had the instructor's approval. Believe it or not, that phrase, by merely inserting appropriate punctuation, can be turned into a grammatically correct single sentence. I'd like you to take a moment now and try to do it. If you think it'll take you more than just a moment, I suggest you pause the tape. Are you ready now? Here's how it goes. John, comma, where Jack had, comma, open quote, had, comma, end quote, had, comma, open quote, had, end quote, semicolon. Quote, had, unquote, had the instructor's approval, period. Let me read that aloud with my voice so you can see how it works. John, where Jack had the instructor's approval. Believe it or not, You can make sense out of these things. You can make sense out of these things on your own, but only if you understand how these things work. A semicolon balances two parts of a related sentence. It also separates items in a series if each of the items in the series itself is required to be subdivided by commas. How do you learn such rules? They're in your handbook. What about foreign words and phrases? Do we put them in italics, capitalize them? Do we translate them? The handbook will even fail you here. In some places you do, in some places you don't. There's an issue of what's called house style. Let me give you an example. A house in this case might be thought of as a publishing house, but it can also be thought of as a company. Companies develop house styles. They want all of their communication to bear a certain similarity in form. In the sentence, I like cookies, cake, and ice cream. Shall I put a comma after cookies and after cake, or shall I not? If I say yes, put the comma after all of them, then what I've said is cookies, cake, and ice cream are three items in a series. That last comma, the one after cake, is called a serial comma because these are items in a series. But the fact is that there is a dessert known as cake and ice cream. And I could easily have said, I like cookies, cake and ice cream, and candy, where there would be no comma after the cake, and cake and ice cream would be the second item in the series. As your reader reads along, he or she doesn't know when he or she encounters cake and ice cream whether or not there will be another item in the series, just for a split second. Because of that, to disambiguate that situation, I personally use a serial comma. I would write cookies, comma, cake, comma, and ice cream. But some people feel, and this is entirely a matter of house style, that serial commas are unnecessary. When you get to the period, I like cookies, comma, cake and ice cream, period, everybody would know something was wrong there. You didn't mean cake and ice cream as a dish, like I like cookies, candy. We need the and, so you'd understand there were three items in the series. That view means no serial comma. My view, serial comma. What's the difference? There is no rule. Therefore, establish house style. If you work for a large corporation, ask for their house style. If you are writing for a teacher, ask your teacher what your teacher feels about those things. If you're writing a lengthy document, make sure that if you use the serial comma at one point, you always use it. If you leave it out at one point, you always leave it out. Establish your own house style. Consistency is another mark of expertise. It's another way to pursue the ethical argument. All of these things can be worked out on your own with thought and the rules only as a guide. How to do it. I suggest you take a document that you or some colleague of yours wrote at least 6 months ago. Or take something which is a comparatively amateur publication. For example, a church bulletin or advertising copy from a small business in a local newspaper, or instructions for some group like the Boy Scouts to prepare for a trip, something like that, a comparatively amateur document. Take that document and edit it using your best judgment, using your handbook and your dictionary, applying the rules to get the grammar, the mechanics, everything just right. When you're done with that, you may want to exchange it with a friend. The two of you may have worked on the same document. If you're watching this lecture as part of a course, you can then take that and put it together with the original document and send it in to instructor for commentary. In other words, a clean copy of the original document or publication, your edited version, and your rationale for the editing. It's your rationale that's most important. You should raise every question you can think of. If a person can't answer it, look in the book. If the book can't answer it, ask a person. If you can't find either, read widely. People use language to communicate, and the best people do it effectively. They do it in control of every detail of editing, a non-mechanical process that grows out of a deep understanding of of what you're really trying to accomplish.